This week, we remember a country music legend. It has been 20 years since Johnny Cash died, but a downtown attraction is giving fans access to the star's life.
September 12th, 2003. A man in a wheelchair sits in the fading afternoon light of a Hendersonville mansion, watching the Tennessee landscape blur beyond the windows. His name is Johnny Cash, and he is dying. Not in the way most people die, with surprise or denial. Johnny knows exactly what's happening to his body. The diabetes has ravaged him. The heart is failing. The voice that once commanded stadiums is now barely a whisper, a ghost of the baritone that made audiences hold their breath. But his mind, sharp and merciless, is more awake than it's been in years. 4 months ago, June Carter Cash was buried in the ground beside him. Not beside him, literally not yet, but she's in the earth. And Johnny is still here, waiting. The woman who saved him, who pulled him back from the edge of oblivion more times than he can count, is gone. And now, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to hide, Johnny Cash is finally ready to tell the truth. Rick Rubin is there that day. The legendary producer, the man who'd spent the last decade documenting Cash's final years, his resurrection through the American recording sessions, has become something more than a collaborator. He's become a witness. He's become a confessor to a dying man who needs to unburden himself before he meets his maker. They'd been working, going through the motions of another recording session, trying to capture whatever voice remained, whatever spirit still flickered. But Johnny's eyes had grown distant. The work didn't matter anymore. Something else was eating at him. Something that had been eating at him for 26 years. Johnny asked Rick to stop the tape machines. Turn them off. All of them. The cameras, the microphones, everything that had become the constant backdrop to his final album sessions. This wasn't for documentation. This wasn't for the archives or the historians or the fans who would dissect every word after he was gone. This was between two men, one of whom would be dead within weeks. Rick Rubin would later describe that afternoon as the most haunting conversation of his entire life. Not because of what Johnny said, though that was devastating enough, but because of how he said it. The tremor in his voice, the way his hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests, the absolute clarity that this secret, this burden that Johnny had carried alone through nearly 3 decades was finally going to destroy him if he didn't release it before death did. The secret was about Elvis Presley. Johnny Cash had known Elvis Presley, not in the way the world knew him. Not as a fan or a fellow performer, or a legend who crossed paths with another legend at industry events. Johnny had known him in a way that very few people on earth ever had. And what Johnny knew about Elvis's life, about his death, about the machinery that had ground him down from a man into a ghost, had been tearing Johnny apart from the inside for 26 years. Since August 16th, 1977, since the day Elvis died, everyone knew the surface story of Elvis's death. The pills, the isolation in Graceland, the strange lifestyle, the yes men, the doctors who wrote prescriptions without asking questions, the bathroom, the heart attack, a life lived too fast, burned out like a candle with too many flames. It fit the narrative that Hollywood wanted to tell, a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of fame, a reminder that even kings could fall to their own weaknesses. But Johnny Cash knew a different story. He knew things about Elvis that would have destroyed careers if they'd gotten out in 1977. He knew things that certain powerful people would have killed to keep buried. He knew about 3 moments, 3 encounters between himself and Elvis that revealed the true tragedy of the king's life. And these weren't moments that appeared in any biography. They weren't captured by photographers or documented by historians or preserved in the official record that the world had agreed to accept. These were private moments. Raw, unfiltered, true, what made this revelation so explosive wasn't just the content of what Cash knew. It was the understanding of why he'd hidden it. Why a man of Johnny's integrity, a man who'd spent his life speaking truth to power, had stayed silent through decades of interviews and documentaries and biographies. It was why he'd watched journalists ask him direct questions about Elvis, watched them lean in with their notebooks and cameras, and seen him choose his words with such careful precision that the lies felt almost like honesty. The reason was simple and terrifying. The people who'd made him keep silent in 1977 were still alive in 2003. Still powerful. Still capable of the kinds of threats that went beyond lawsuits or public scandals. The Colonel had been dead for years, but the machinery he'd built was still functioning. The people who'd benefited from Elvis's death, who'd profited from it, who'd structured entire financial empires around it, they were still breathing. They still had resources. They still had reach. And if Cash had spoken, his family would have paid the price. But now, sitting in that wheelchair, Johnny had made a calculation that only a dying man could make. He had maybe days left. Weeks at most. What could they do to him now? Kill him? He was already dying. Arrest him? For what speaking about a private conversation with a dead man? Sue him? Money meant nothing when you were about to leave everything behind. The only currency that mattered now was his soul. And his soul was withering under the weight of this secret. June was gone. That changed everything. June had been the anchor that kept him holding on to silence, to safety, to the careful navigation of a life lived partially in truth and partially in omission. June had understood the threats in a way that made her urge caution. Protect the family, keep the peace, let the dead rest. But June was in the ground now, and Johnny was about to follow her. And somewhere in that terrible mathematics, Johnny realized that the cost of silence had become higher than the cost of truth. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Rick Rubin watched as an old man, barely clinging to life, finally made the decision to let go of a burden that had been crushing him since before he was old, since before his body began its slow betrayal, since before the industry that had made him a legend had conspired to make Elvis a cautionary tale. Johnny Cash was ready to tell what he knew. The story, Johnny explained, began in Memphis, not in the glitz of the Graceland mansion that would later define Elvis's life, and not on any stage where crowds screamed and security held back the hysteria. The story began in a converted auto repair shop called Sun Records, where a man named Sam Phillips had built a temple to American music from the bones of obsolete machinery and raw ambition. It was December 4th, 1956, and history would remember it as the $1 Million Quartet Session. 4 young men around a piano: Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. The photographs that survive that day show them almost casual, almost spontaneous, captured in what the world believed was an impromptu jam session between friends. The cameras caught them smiling, playing, connected by the music and the moment. But those photographs, now famous and reproduced in countless books and documentaries, only told half the story. They told the half that Sam Phillips wanted the world to see. The other half, the real half, happened after the tape machines stopped rolling, after the reporters packed up their equipment and left Memphis for other cities and other stories, after the world had moved on to whatever else demanded its attention. That's when Elvis asked Johnny to stay behind. Johnny was 24 years old that night, and while he'd already tasted success with songs like I Walk the Line, he was still climbing. He was still hungry in a way that Elvis, at 21, had already learned to fear. Elvis was already the biggest star in America. He'd exploded onto the national consciousness like a meteor and the trajectory of his rise had been so vertical, so unprecedented, that nobody, not even Elvis himself, fully understood what was happening to him. The culture was still reeling from his appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show just weeks before, the cameras cutting him off at the waist because his hips were too dangerous, too sexual, too much of a threat to American morality. The establishment was terrified of him. The young people were obsessed with him, and Elvis himself was beginning to understand that he'd stepped into something that was far larger and far darker than teenage rebellion. Sam Phillips excused himself from his own studio. Johnny and Elvis were alone as Memphis grew dark outside the windows. The neon of Beale Street reflected off the glass, casting strange shadows across the control room. And that's when the swagger disappeared. The sneer that Elvis had perfected for the cameras, the confidence he projected in photographs and on television, all of it evaporated. What Johnny saw in that moment was a terrified kid. Not the king, not the revolutionary, not the man who'd changed American music forever. Just a young man who'd already figured out that he'd made a deal with forces he couldn't begin to understand. Elvis told Johnny something that night that would have destroyed his career if it had gotten out in 1956. Something that would have given his enemies the ammunition they needed to tear him down completely. Something about Colonel Tom Parker that very few people in the world knew. Parker had only been managing Elvis for a year at that point. Just 1 year. But in that short time, the cage was being built around the young singer with a precision and deliberateness that suggested long practice. Parker wasn't just a manager. He was an architect of control. And what Elvis had discovered, what had sent genuine terror through him, was that Parker's hold over him went far deeper than standard management contracts and commission percentages. The Colonel had gambling debts, not small debts, not the kind of thing a man could work off with time and discipline. These were catastrophic debts that ran so deep that Parker was essentially drowning in them. The men he owed money to weren't music industry executives or even legitimate businessmen. They were people who collected debts in blood. They were people who understood that a living debtor was worthless, but a controlled debtor was an asset. And they'd seen in Colonel Parker exactly what they needed, a man desperate enough to do anything to keep himself alive. That's when they discovered Elvis. Parker had essentially handed them the solution to his problems in the form of a young man with a voice that could make people weep and hips that could make them riot. Elvis became collateral. Elvis became a golden goose that would lay eggs for decades, and those eggs would pay off Parker's debts forever. The Colonel didn't own a piece of Elvis because he believed in the kid's talent. He owned Elvis because Elvis was the only thing between him and the people who'd break his legs. Or worse. Elvis had discovered this truth accidentally. He'd overheard a telephone conversation that Parker didn't know he was listening to. The Colonel, thinking he was alone, speaking with one of the men behind the gambling debts, discussing the arrangements, how long they could expect to profit from the young singer, what contingencies were in place if Elvis became less profitable. It was clinical. It was mathematical. It was a conversation about extracting maximum value from a human being, and Elvis had heard every word. Johnny watched as Elvis's hand shook while he explained this, not from fear of the Colonel exactly, but from the deeper understanding that had crystallized in that moment of accidental eavesdropping. He wasn't a singer who'd been lucky enough to catch the attention of a manager. He was a product. He was a financial instrument. He was collateral in a debt transaction, and the men holding his contract had already calculated exactly how many years of work it would take to make them whole. Elvis made Johnny promise that night to keep this secret, but he said something else, something that would prove far more haunting over the years that followed. He told Cash that if anything ever happened to him, if he died young, Johnny should know it wasn't just the music business that had killed him. It was the business behind the business. The shadowy figures who owned pieces of him like he was a corporation rather than a human being. the contract he'd signed when he was too young to read the fine print. And then Elvis did something that chilled Johnny to his core. He began to predict his own future with an eerie, prophetic clarity. The movies he didn't want to make, but would be forced to, one after another, draining him creatively until there was nothing left but a hollow shell going through the motions. The artistic death that would come before the physical death. The pills that would be pushed on him by doctors who didn't care, managed by people who needed him sedated enough to perform, but conscious enough to generate revenue. The isolation. The paranoia. The way the world would turn him from a man into a mythology, and how that mythology would become a prison he couldn't escape. Elvis laid it all out that night like he was reading from a script that had already been written, already been decided, already been set in stone by forces far more powerful than a 21-year-old kid with a voice. And the most terrifying part was his resignation to it. He'd already accepted his fate. At 21 years old, Elvis Presley had already accepted that his life was no longer his own. 12 years passed between that conversation at Sun Records and the moment that would haunt Johnny Cash for the rest of his life. 12 years during which Elvis became exactly what he'd predicted he would become. The movies came, one after another, each more forgettable than the last, draining the artistry from him like blood from a wound. The pills accumulated. The isolation deepened. The machinery around him grew more sophisticated, more insidious, more complete. By 1968, Elvis Presley was a man who'd been systematically dismantled by the very people who claimed to love him most. But 1968 was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be his resurrection. The black leather comeback special had been announced, and for the first time in years, there was a possibility that Elvis could reclaim what he'd lost. The Colonel had finally agreed to let him perform live again, to strip away the Hollywood machinery and remind America why they'd fallen in love with him in the first place. There were rehearsals happening. There was energy. There was, for a brief moment, the possibility that Elvis might actually find his way back to himself before it was too late. Johnny Cash knew better. And he knew this because he'd been the one to find Elvis collapsed on the bathroom floor at Graceland in November 1968, just 3 weeks before the comeback special was scheduled to film. Johnny had come to Graceland unannounced. Both men were deep in their own battles with amphetamines at that time, and while Johnny had June Carter pulling him back from the edge, her voice, her presence, her refusal to let him disappear, completely Elvis had nobody except the doctors who kept filling prescriptions without asking questions. The reports coming back to Nashville were disturbing. People who'd been to Graceland spoke in hushed tones about how thin Elvis had become, how distant, how the light in his eyes had gone out. Johnny was worried in a way that only another addict could be worried, with the kind of desperate understanding that comes from recognizing yourself in someone else's spiral. The mansion was quiet when he arrived. The gates opened because the security team knew him, because Johnny Cash was one of the few people Elvis still trusted enough to let through without announcement. But that quiet was wrong. There was something suffocating about it, something that made Johnny's instincts scream that something was very badly broken. He found him on the bathroom floor of the master suite. Elvis was sprawled across Italian marble, and foam was crusted at the corners of his mouth. For those terrible seconds before Johnny checked for a pulse, he thought he was already gone. The terror of those moments screaming for help in a mansion full of people trained to look the other way would replay in Johnny's nightmares for decades. He was screaming Elvis's name, his hands on the young man's chest, praying for a heartbeat, praying for any sign of life. The help came too fast, almost like they'd been expecting this call. Dr. Nick, Elvis's personal physician, arrived within minutes, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this before, who knew exactly what to do in this exact situation. The security team that Johnny had alerted suddenly developed amnesia about the evening's events. Stories were coordinated. Details were erased. The machinery of cover-up moved into motion with a precision that suggested it had been rehearsed, that contingencies for exactly this moment had been prepared long in advance. And then Colonel Parker showed up at 2 a.m, not to check on Elvis's condition, not to call an ambulance or summon additional medical help. He came to have a very specific conversation with Johnny Cash while the king lay sedated upstairs, his life no longer in his own hands. That conversation, held in Elvis's office with the smell of expensive cigars and old leather, was less a discussion and more a series of threats wrapped in false concern and business-like precision. Parker knew about Johnny's arrest record. He knew about the drugs, the close calls, every moment of weakness that could be weaponized. He made it clear that if Johnny ever spoke about what he'd seen that night, the world would hear a very different story about the man in black. A story about drug addiction, about jealousy, about instability. A story that would destroy everything Johnny had built. But it was the second part of Parker's threat that truly broke Johnny. The colonel had connections that went beyond the music industry, beyond even the mob figures everyone suspected he was involved with. These were people who could solve problems permanently. People who didn't leave loose ends. Parker made it crystal clear that Johnny's family, June, the children, everyone Johnny loved, could become problems that needed solving if Johnny decided to become a problem himself. The threat was wrapped in language that sounded almost friendly, but the meaning was unmistakable. Keep quiet or suffer consequences that would extend far beyond Johnny himself. When Elvis finally came to, when Johnny was allowed to see him briefly before being escorted off the property by security, the young singer grabbed Cash's hand with surprising strength. Elvis whispered something that would haunt Johnny forever. He said he knew exactly what he'd taken. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't an accidental overdose born from carelessness or confusion. This was deliberate. This was a test. Elvis's way of seeing if anyone in his life would actually try to save him or if they would just let him die. The answer terrified both men. If Johnny hadn't shown up uninvited, if he hadn't forced his way past the gates and found Elvis in those crucial moments, the king of rock and roll would have died in 1968. The official story would have been natural causes or exhaustion. Nobody would have questioned it. And the machine that had destroyed him would have simply moved on to its next victim, having learned nothing, having changed nothing. By 1976, Johnny Cash hadn't seen Elvis in person for years. They'd crossed paths at industry events, exchanged letters, spoken on the phone in ways that were careful and measured, always aware that other ears might be listening. The intimacy they'd once shared, the raw honesty of that night in Sam Phillips's office, the desperation of that bathroom floor at Grassland, had been replaced by the kind of distance that only fear and secrecy could create. But in the spring of that year, Elvis was performing in Las Vegas, and Johnny made a point to be there. He needed to see his friend one more time. He needed to know if there was anything left of the man he'd once known, or if the machine had finally completed its work. The backstage area at the Las Vegas venue was controlled chaos. Security everywhere. The Memphis Mafia circling like sharks. The entourage that had become more important than the man at the center of it. But Elvis saw Johnny, and something in his face changed. It was like a door opening that had been locked for a very long time. He hugged Cash with an intensity that surprised them both, pulling him close, holding on longer than was comfortable, like he was trying to memorize the feeling of another human being who actually cared about him. The transformation was staggering. The Elvis standing in front of Johnny was barely recognizable as the man who'd been so vibrant, so dangerous, so alive just a few years earlier. Bloated from the pills and the isolation, his face puffy, his movements sluggish, his eyes carrying a weight that no human being should have to carry alone. But beneath all of that physical deterioration, Johnny saw something else. Clarity, terrible, absolute clarity. They found a private moment away from the crowds, away from the cameras and the handlers and the people who existed only to extract value from Elvis's remaining years. And that's when Elvis said something that would echo in Johnny's mind until his own death. Something so specific, so certain, that it couldn't possibly be dismissed as the rambling of a drugged mind. "Johnny, I'll be dead by 42. Write me a song when I'm gone, but tell them the truth when you're ready to join me." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Johnny's initial reaction was to dismiss it as the pills talking, as the paranoia and depression that came with being a prisoner in your own life. But Elvis wasn't high that night. He was more lucid than he'd been in years, and he pulled Johnny closer and began to lay out exactly how it would happen. Not the when he'd already done that, but the how. The specific, methodical how. Elvis told him about the bathroom. He told him about the heart, about how the combination of medications he'd been prescribed would eventually trigger cardiac arrest in a way that would look natural, that would look like the consequence of his own excess rather than what it actually was. He told Johnny that he'd been planning this for months, that it wasn't suicide in the traditional sense, but something far more calculated. It was the only escape route from a contract that wouldn't end until his heart did. The financial prison that Elvis described that night was more elaborate than anything Johnny could have imagined. The Colonel hadn't just owned a percentage of Elvis's earnings through standard management deals. Parker had essentially sold futures on Elvis's corpse. There were insurance policies that would activate upon his death. There were release contracts that stipulated posthumous earnings would flow to certain parties for decades after he was gone. There were merchandising deals, licensing agreements, and financial instruments so complex that they required lawyers to explain them and accountants to track them. Elvis had discovered these documents during his divorce proceedings with Priscilla, hidden in safety deposit boxes he wasn't supposed to know about. When he realized what they contained, when he understood that his death was literally worth more to certain people than his life, something inside him had broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. The revelation wasn't just that he was trapped. It was that his entrapment was structured, mathematical, and permanent. The only variable was time. Johnny tried to argue with him that night. He tried to convince Elvis that there were other ways, that they could figure this out together, that suicide wasn't the answer. But Elvis shook his head with a patience that was almost unbearable. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't desperation talking. This was a man who'd spent 16 years being systematically destroyed and had finally arrived at the only logical conclusion. The business model required his death. The people who'd built fortunes on his existence were betting on it. So why not take the one thing he had left control over when and how it happened? Cash wrestled with this knowledge through Elvis's final year, watching from a distance as his friend grew sicker, more isolated, more resigned to his fate. The guilt was suffocating. The knowledge that he could have done something, should have done something, but was held back by the Colonel's threats and his own family's safety. It became his greatest regret, the stone he'd carry to his own grave. When news of Elvis's death reached him on August 16, 1977, Johnny locked himself in his bathroom and wept. Not from surprise, not from shock, but from the crushing weight of inevitability. Elvis had called his own death down to the year, to the age, to the exact moment when the machinery would finally wind down. 42 years old. Just like he'd said. But the story didn't end with Elvis's funeral. 3 weeks after the burial, Cash received a package with no return address, postmarked from Memphis the day before Elvis died. Elvis Presley wasn't weak. He wasn't a cautionary tale about fame and excess. He was a prisoner who chose the only exit available to him, a man who orchestrated his own death as carefully as he'd once orchestrated his performances. The tragedy wasn't that Elvis died young. It was that the music industry created a system where death became his only way to achieve freedom. Elvis didn't die from drugs, Johnny whispered in those final days. He died from slavery. The pills were just the method. The cause was the contract he signed when he was too young to know that fame could be a death sentence. More than 90% of the people watching right now still aren't subscribed, and that means you're missing exclusive Elvis revelations you won't find anywhere else. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with one friend before it's taken down. The truth about what really happened to the king is still being hidden. Don't miss the next chapter.